Hi class, my name is Avelyn Ellis and this project is part of the Sociology Senior Seminar, and I chose my project on how parents make sense of mortality and meaning making. And so let's begin. So my research aim, like I said, is how do parents of young children specifically make meaning out of their own mortality, how they know they're going to die, and what coping mechanisms do they use to mitigate this stress because it causes death anxiety. So we can see this as accumulating two kinds of roles. We have the parent role, and then we have the mortal person role. Both have responsibilities and stresses. So we have a couple things I want to talk to you about today. We'll go through the literature review, my research methods, discussion, and then conclusion, or kind of a reflection of what I gained from this. So we'll start with the literature review. I have conducted a lot of research on mainly these three concepts and these theories. We'll start with death anxiety as a response to mortality salience, or the awareness of one's own mortality, and then the stress of mortality and coping. So that is like stress that we learned about in class, that stress process, and coping mechanisms, and two main theories that I have definitely done a lot of research on. And then we have to get more specific into parenting and why it's important to realize parents as a singular concept, because they have their own responsibilities, and we can look at the life course theory and how they make meaning themselves. So we'll start with death anxiety. Two notable articles that I read were Solmani and Symington. So Solmani defined death anxiety as the fear in response to one's own perception of their death or dying process. And Symington defined it as an unpleasant emotional state in reference to your own death, the death of others, or death in general. And I'm sorry if you don't like listening to this. I know it's a very uncomfortable topic, and because there's a lot of taboo surrounding death, but this is a part of life. And I thought it was important to research this, and that's where I can fill in the gaps. Is these two researchers did a lot of research on people with illnesses. Solmani did empirical research on people with it's called acute myocardial infarction, and they're dying. And then Symington, I think, they studied death anxiety when nursing students had perceptions of different people, like specifically it was older adults, and how do they view life and death, and getting older when they have the response of, or when they have the stimulant or stimulus of mortality salience, which researchers can give in various forms, like just talking about it or reading something about death. So that's where I can fill in the gaps. Is I wanted to study how regular people, people that maybe aren't dying necessarily, but everyone deals with this in their own kind of way. So I wanted to study them specifically. So moving into stress of mortality and coping, we have the very notable Perlin article and his other article on the stress processes, and he notably noticed or researched that there are three main components of the stress process. We have the stressors, moderators, and outcomes. Yes, you can argue that death anxiety is any which one, but for this study, I kind of organized it as a moderator. Death anxiety is kind of a stressor, and then moderators as we have our coping mechanisms and how we deal with that. So this is particularly important because when you have the awareness of your death and it causes anxiety or fear, how do we modify that stress? Are we going to make, try and be healthy and towards longevity? How are we going to make meaning out of that stress? Do people turn to religion, or they turn to support of others? And how do they manage that stress symptoms? Maybe how it feels in their body, or, like I said, social support. So moving into further that, the stress of mortality, we have two incredible theories. We have terror management theory, created by Greenberg et al., and symbolic immortality. So terror management theory focuses on how, when you have mortality salience, how do you make meaning, and how do you manage your behavior or your self-identity in response to that? And what Vale and Jewell noticed was that mortality salience or awareness was a motivator for health or behavior and love and cultivating relationships and community. And we have two really important terror management theory dimensions. We have how individuals will use self-esteem, or their values, or who they believe as a person in their roles in society and for themselves, and they will use that to buffer the stress of death. But they will also use that very ingrained in embedded cultural worldviews and what they believe or perceive society perceives as important to understanding death and why it's important. So, as we know, stress is social. So, death anxiety as a stressor is incredibly social. And another really important theory is symbolic immortality, by Plisson et al. And this was seen in many articles and by many researchers, but this one in particular noticed that relationships can relieve death anxiety. They particularly studied how marital relationships and significant others can help relieve death anxiety. But what symbolic immortality is larger is that it's really when you are in these relationships and these networks, you feel like you're contributing to something bigger than yourself. You have values that are maybe outside of yourself, and this can kind of create a sense that you yourself are going to transcend death. You're going to have a kind of symbolic immortalization through your contribution to that relationship. So this is really important for parents. Parents are very specific. They are going through a major life transition. They have role strain. They have so many responsibilities. And what's so interesting is that they are in the unique situation of caring for a child who's developing, but they also know they're going to die one day. And they might not think about it all the time. Some maybe do, and it's really a booster for how they want to interact with their children, but sometimes they don't. But it is always kind of in the back of their mind, and they will utilize different coping mechanisms to buffer that stress. So Hope et al. Notably researched a lot about how mortality salience can kind of act as a booster for reproduction. People tend to, in very certain circumstances, want to have the bigger desire to reproduce offspring and sooner. And I think the research shows it has a lot to do with symbolic immortality specifically. We have a genetic and evolutionary predisposition to want to not just pass on our genes, but pass on ourselves. We want to live. So, and we can be kind of scared of death. So parenting and reproduction and mortality salience are very interestingly related in this specific aspect. So after I did my literature review, very heavy, I created 3 hypotheses based on what I saw in the literature, the concepts, and their own theories. Created 3. The first one is that parents will utilize death anxiety coping mechanisms that will be tied to what we saw in terror management theory, self-esteem and cultural worldview, embedded in cultural worldview. And for the second hypothesis, I said that parents will seek social support and close relationships to buffer this kind of death anxiety stress, including their close partnerships and the relationships that they have with their children. And hypothesis 3 is that parents will utilize subjective meaning making and symbolic immortality, creating a legacy of the self. I included this one because I felt that for my qualitative study and trying to get that depth and interviewing parents on a very holistic level, I wanted to create the space for them to be able to express themselves maybe with religion or other coping mechanisms that I hadn't thought of or that I hadn't researched. So that's why I included that hypothesis, but it is based in the literature. So after I created that, we go into our methods of conceptualization and operationalization. So I was very thorough in utilizing key concepts that I'd seen in my literature review and creating nominal and operational definitions for each. So the nominal definition, pretty basic, but mostly taken straight out of the literature. And operationalization was the definition. It kind of includes a lot of what other people saw people utilizing, like, and how you can see that in the actual interviews. And what I thought I might personally see parents say, or things they might say, thoughts they might have, or kind of like subtle things that they might do or say that will give off the impression that they align with this key concept. So interestingly, death anxiety was a huge one because I had seen it in the literature. But I also added death acceptance and grief, which I also saw in the literature, but not heavily related to death anxiety. I think it's important to add, and what I feel like I can contribute in researching parents and death anxiety is that we are human beings and we all have very differing and vast experiences or thoughts surrounding death. And I wanted to hold space for lots of different experiences. For example, with the grief, I knew previously, before the interviews, that a couple interviewees had experiences with loved ones dying. So I wanted to hold space for that concept that could quickly align and deeply align with their experience. With stress coping and meaning making, yes, I of course included symbolic immortality, but I also wanted to include some spirituality and religion and social support because I felt that people, especially in the research that I had done on these topics, this is very important with how we cope with the stress of death. And I thought it was equally as important for parents because they are humans. So, for my interview methods, I interviewed 3 parents. Each they had young children, and I created a previous interview guide, a couple questions, maybe 10 or 12, and it was fluid. It kind of changed throughout the research process. I did the interviews at my home. Each was about 1 hour long, and they were audio recorded and transcribed automatically through that process. So the way that I created the questions was I wanted to go from general and to deeper. I wanted to be very aware of the fact that talking about this can be very tricky, and I knew they wanted to talk about it because they had told me, but I still wanted to be sensitive. So of course I got their informed consent. I made sure they were comfortable, gave them water, tissues. I thought that was very important in like the ethics. They are humans and they are giving me their time, and I wanted to respect them. So my kind of the way I also managed the topics of the questions was I asked background questions first, then I went into parenting, talking about maybe the things that feel fulfilling for the parents, and then maybe things that maybe feel really stressful. And then we went into more talking straight into mortality, kind of questions like, are there any particular experiences that you've had that have shaped how you think about death? And everyone, of course, has had at least one top experience of how death has impacted them. And then we moved in, or did I say that right? Or I think background, yeah, parenting, then mortality, and then meaning making. Meaning making, definitely getting into how parenting and death anxiety and maybe symbolic immortality all kind of come together and how they buffer the stress of death. And we'll get into a little bit more about that later. And then I wanted to end with some grounding questions to make sure that they had some good positive feedback and they were feeling okay, and anything else that they wanted to add. So the sampling methods, definitely purposive, definitely non-probability. I only interviewed 3 people. I had already had the trust established with them. These were people that I knew in my own life. No, they were not my own parents, although that would be interesting. I interviewed 2 mothers and 1 father. Everyone was between 30 and 45 years old, and they varied in race and ethnicity. If you want those demographics, I can totally give them to you upon request. And they were all of middle socioeconomic status. Each, interestingly, had a dual income family. So each of the participants was very unique in their alignments with how they thought about death and parenting, but they were also very similar. And I'll get into that a little bit in a moment. So for coding and analysis, my methods are still in the process. And I'm taking detailed notes after I really cleaned up the transcripts and made sure there were no spelling errors and everything was very clear and I could tell what they were talking about. I'm going through each line or each quote and writing some key things to note what I think generally or more specifically you could say about what they exactly said. And so this includes short phrases or subcodes. And then after that, for each of them, I go into more kind of specific or general. I know that's kind of doesn't make sense, but it does in my head. Key concepts that specific meaning from my conceptualization, and general meaning the big ones, like the 3 that I talked about: mortality, or death anxiety, parenting, and like the stress or the meaning making and the buffering. So yes, I will. I'm in the process of accumulating different quotes that people said and putting them in a matrix, kind of comparing and contrasting, seeing how they maybe differ and how they might be similar. And so this is a very systematic way of analyzing qualitative interviews. So for the discussion that I can tell you so far, all of these interviews definitely align with terror management theory and symbolic immortality, in that parents definitely use self-esteem to buffer the stress of death, and they align themselves with cultural worldviews. So what I saw definitely was that parents were aware or relying on their sense of, I'm a good parent and I might not know what I'm doing all the time, but I really try. And that's what I feel like society expects from parents. And whatever that meant for them, but also within society, stress is social. So, in relation to the death topics, they were very different, but they also had similarities. They all were aware of the death taboo in Western society, or in America specifically. People don't really want to talk about it. Uh, Only one of the participants said that they frequently talk to their loved one about it, about death specifically. And the other ones, they did not. It's not that they didn't feel comfortable talking about death, it's just that it wasn't very common, or when are you going to schedule that in your timeline for the day? So people differ in their dispositions and what they want, but I think that they all did express that they want to talk about it, and eventually that's one of the questions I asked is, you're going to have to ask, or your kids might ask about death. What are you going to tell them? Or if they already have, are you okay with what you might have said to them? And if your future kid, the kid that's the youngest, what if he says something about death? Are you going to say the same thing you said to your oldest child? And some of them said yes, some of them said no. So, one of the main things, moving on from the topic of death, is that something I really noticed as kind of a side note is that parents judge each other. Oh my goodness. I did not even ask them a question about this, but they all said, kind of towards the end, why they felt they were so pleased to get this off their chest was because they can't talk to parents about parenting, especially about death. They cannot talk to parents because parents are judging each other. Everyone thinks they're doing the right thing and they're the best way of doing it. And that was really interesting. So I think it kind of ties into symbolic immortality a little bit, and like what you feel like, um, you know. Well, that's the next thing is that symbolic immortality was really different in the ways I thought it would show up. Um, the research that I did made it sound really sterile. Like parents were altruistic, but not fully, in that they loved their children, of course, don't get me wrong, but um, that it was kind of like they were using their children as a buffer to death, and that I definitely saw a transcendence of that in the interviews, in specific ways that their identities as parents were no longer tied to just themselves. It was their children primarily. And I think that is a little bit of a stress buffer itself, but the love that these people had for their children just seemed to transcend anything that I thought would be the identity of yourself. It was powerful and really transformative, I think, for them and for me. So moving on, I don't get too into this. I'm running out of time, but one of the questions I asked were, are there particular experiences that have shaped how you think about death now as a parent? And these are not their real names, of course, and um, Eddie in particular said he's going to live forever. And he said that a couple of times in the interview, and he knew he wasn't really going to live forever, but he was really sticking to that mindset. And he was an older parent, and he wanted to be there throughout his child's life. Um, and I think that might have a little bit to do with symbolic immortality, but definitely a terror management response and stress buffering, self identity. I'm going to live long to see my kid grow up. He also said he's going to savor every moment because he wants to see his child grow up. So, and then another response was from Jenny. Um, she said that it was really hard to stop thinking about death and the finiteness of time, but she said that having children helps that because they're so in the moment, and you don't really have time to think about anything else as a parent. You're especially with young children, so it kind of helped to get out of that thought process. Some pretty interesting responses, I thought. So the next question, this is the last one. I asked, what experiences, values, or qualities do you hope your child carries with them as they grow? And this one was huge. This one felt like a direct reflection of symbolic immortality. Yes, I was a little bit sly. I wanted to see how they would want their own qualities to transcend in the world through their children. Maybe not themselves or what they would have done differently. And so I was directly involved in symbolic immortality, and everyone, of course, said they wanted their child to be caring. They loved their children. They wanted them to grow up and be a caring and kind individual and love other people. In my opinion, this is because they have had the experience of how being a loving and caring person has so many benefits for themselves and others. And I think that's why it's a little bit tied to symbolic immortality, but also on a just deeply personal level that you get in interviews and qualitative studies is that this is just people's lives and their experience. And it can really, in my opinion, just be as simple as that. They wanted their kids to just be caring children, caring people, caring adults. And that's what, parents of course would want. Very involved, but also very simple. And I thought very loving. So my last minute, my reflection on this has been profound. This project has consumed my life in a really good way. But there are limitations, of course. There's no generalizability. But I think that this can, especially with the literature review and how I've tied the experiences of these parents into the larger theories, you can make some suggestions for further research. Interestingly, there's a bit of a snowballing effect going on. Funny enough, parents want to talk about this. Not everyone, but they want to talk about the hidden and the taboo because we don't get to talk about this very much. And we can make so much meaning out of death and what it means to us because it's how you make sense of your life. You're gonna experience death once, but you're going to know you'll live your life knowing it's gonna happen. So how are you gonna live your life? And especially when you have kids and they're growing up and you know your time is not always long with them. So personally transformative for me, deeply existential. It was really, I had to do a lot of memoing and journaling about this, but I've taken it as insight into how it can inform my analysis because I'm connecting with these parents not just on a researcher level, but on a very human level. And that kind of, I think it's the Cooley's looking glass theory. You see yourself, you perceive what others perceive of you, and that kind of informs how you see yourself. And this has that kind of aspect of it has just been instrumental. And of course, I want to continue doing this. The research has been very interesting, and I've been very excited and bursting at the seams to tell anybody because I find it both so fascinating. So, anyways, thank you. I can give you my bibliography upon request or any other documentation you might need. But thank you so much for listening. I know that was a bit long, but I find it so fascinating. If you have any questions, I'd love to answer. Thank you very much.